So today we have Dr. Walter Dekeseredy is going to be providing, like I said, the keynote. Dr. Dekeseredy is the Anna Dean Carlson Endowed Chair of Social Sciences and Director of the Research Center on Violence at West Virginia University. He has published 24 books and over 130 scientific journal articles and book chapters on violence against women and other social problems. In 2008, the Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma gave him the Linda Saltzman Memorial Intimate Partner Violence Researcher Award. He also jointly received the 2004 Distinguished Scholar Award from the American Society of Criminology Division on Women and Crime and the 2007 inaugural University of Ontario Institute of Technology Research Excellence Award. In 1995, he received the Critical Criminologist of the Year Award from the ASC's Division on Critical Criminology. In 2008, the DCC, Division of Critical Criminology, gave him the Lifetime Achievement Award. And in 2014, the Academy of Critical Criminal Justice section gave him the Critical Criminal Justice Scholar Award. And then more recently, talking to him just a little bit ago this year, he actually received the Impact Award from the Victimology section of ACGS. And prior to that, the Career Achievement Award from the Victimology section of ASC in 2015. So I will go ahead and hand this over to Dr. Dekeseredy.
Thank you very much. After hearing that, I feel quite old. It's really a pleasure to be here, actually an honor to be here, and I was very much looking forward to my visit when I met, I got an email from Dr. Blackwell, who's chair of the Criminal Justice and Criminology program, and asking me to come and talk about rural criminology issues. And then everything came to fruition. Dr. Grubb contacted me, and so it's a reality, and I'm having such a great time. And one of the wonderful things about coming for a visit, and I hope you experience this and continue to experience it during the course of your career here at Georgia Southern, one of the most important things of elements of an academic program is to, come to presentations or sit down with colleagues and have meaningful conversations about ideas, because that's what universities and colleges should be about, in my humble opinion, about generating ideas, exchanging ideas, critiquing ideas. And as I progress through my career, increasingly I'm finding colleges and universities to be more concerned with corporatization rather than the generation of ideas. So it's so vital to keep things like this in motion and to bring in outside people and get us all together in a room like this to talk about some of the most compelling social problems that plague our society today. I'm going to talk for basically maybe 40 to 45 minutes so that we can open it for discussion, because I think the topic warrants considerable discussion. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. All right, because there were some microphone problems. But I want to, first of all, talk about the main objective of my presentation. The clicker, oh, here we are, okay. This is a very interesting book for those of you who are into violence against women and child abuse research. It's a book that basically maps the terrain in the field. And the editors, who are very prominent in their field, asked contributors to answer what they refer to as three seemingly simple questions. What do we know? How do we know it? And what are the next steps? And that's what I'm going to do in my presentation. What do we know about violence against women in rural communities? How do we know it? And where do we go from here? Okay, so that's what I'm going to try to achieve in today's talk. Until recently, violence against rural women was given short shrift by the social scientific community. Now, how many folks here are criminal justice and criminology majors? Can I see a show of hands? Okay. So how often in your studies, and this is by no means an indictment of your professors, the question I'm going to ask you will probably lead to an indictment of the entire field. How many of you have come across research or theoretical work on rural issues? One person in the back. One person. What does that tell you? And 49% of the world's population is rural. Now again, this is not your professor's fault, because the vast majority of criminologists in this country in particular are urban biased. they completely ignore problems that exist in rural communities. And it's a serious issue that warrants considerable attention. And so now we're seeing a rapidly growing body of literature, empirical, theoretical, and policy related, that's focusing on different types of rural problems, rural social control. And the research on violence against women or woman abuse in rural communities has rapidly grown since the latter part of the last decade, with much of it generated in the United States, and the bulk of it generated by feminist scholars. Okay, I want to first look at some of the false images of rural life, which are in large part perpetuated by the mainstream media. And this is an image we often see on television. You know, remember, for those of you who may be in the Flintstone era, Little House on the Prairie, shows like that portrayed, you know, communities as simpler, everyone's nice to each other, there's a high level of collective efficacy where people are working together for the common good, and there's a little schoolhouse and all the children go there, or you know, the Andy Griffith show, you know, where it's Main Street rural community, and there may be, the only deviant is maybe Otis the drunk who drinks too much and they throw him into the jailhouse for the night. So that's a very common image. And I'm not saying that rural communities aren't nice. There are many nice communities, but there are some rural realities. And just as a prelude to what I'm going to talk about later on, actually we have research in this country and in Canada and across the world showing that many rural communities have higher rates of violence than do their suburban and urban counterparts. And I'll get into that in greater detail because there is a dark side of rural life. And also, these newspapers and other media often portray rural communities as being very nice. People are nicer to each other. Well, actually, there's some very interesting rural sociological literature showing high levels of xenophobia, in other words, a dislike of outsiders or a fear of outsiders. And if you look at this latest election, and forgive me if I don't mean to offend anyone here, but rural communities were heavily responsible for the election of President Trump. Rural communities tend to be very conservative politically, and we see research showing that they're not necessarily nicer to others than we're often led to believe by the mainstream media. And there's an entire body of work on that, which I don't have time to get into today. And of course, the media often portray rural communities as remaining somewhat behind the times. These horrible stereotypes, like in these old shows, you know, the Beverly Hillbillies and so on. And now there's a spate of these new shows on channels such as the Learning Channel, Duck Dynasty, and these other shows that portraying people as rednecks and hicks and hillbillies and so on and so forth. And I find these shows very damaging, actually. And coming from West Virginia, although I'm a Canadian who lives there now, I have become highly sensitized to negative stereotypes of rural people. And they're quite hurtful, and they're very, very, to say the least, inaccurate. Here are two other common negative stereotypes of rural people. Have you noticed the vast majority of horror movies, especially the slasher films, take place in rural areas? And the perpetrators are often portrayed as, you know, mad, deranged, inbred hicks. You know, we have Jason, we have The Hills Have Eyes, and so on. If you're interested in more about this, I can send you an article I wrote on the horrification and pornification of rural culture. And this genre of movies started in 1972 with the film Deliverance, which was nominated for several Academy Awards. And since then, you know, we see these common themes. This is in the movie Deliverance, someone who has some issues. And these are some other, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and so on and so forth, you know. And they're remaking these movies. I mean, I remember when Friday the 13th first came out in 1978, and it was one of the most gruesome slasher films at that time. Now we have remakes of it, and we have Friday the 13th Part 28, and so on and so forth, right? So, and this is typically what many urban people are exposed to. These are the primary images that they receive. Now, I'm not saying all urban or suburban people are ignorant. I'm not saying that, but I find there is insufficient, accurate knowledge about the realities of rural life. Now, let's look at Canada, which generally has lower rates of violent crime than the United States. In fact, the homicide rate overall is 3 to 4 times lower than that of the United States. And also keep in mind, 90% of Americans and Canadians live within 200 miles of each other's border. Now, Canada is often inaccurately portrayed as being entirely rural, which is not the case. Or what I get sick and tired of hearing, oh, you're from Canada, it's cold up there. Well, have you heard of Minnesota, North Dakota, Wyoming, and so on? There are a lot of cold places in this country, too. And you take Toronto, which is now the 4th largest city in North America. Now, Chicago had 762 homicides last year. 762 in 1 year. And they're heading to even more this year, the rate things are going. Toronto only had 62 homicides last year, which is quite incredible. But if you look at urban-rural differences, in Canada, the rural rate of homicide is higher than the urban and suburban, and has been for the last 10 years. And that's due in large part to high levels of gun ownership, and many of these murders are what you would define as domestics, men killing their partners or ex-partners, okay? So, and that's something I think that's really important to note, because Canada's often portrayed in the literature as the kinder, gentler nation, especially among advanced industrial nations. And then, of course, we have these stereotypes. Often women are categorized in media about rural life as either the hardened grandmothers or, you know, like Jessica Simpson and the Dukes of Hazzard, and I forget the name of this actress who starred in the original one. And, of course, these images you see in pornographic media on, there's a whole body of imagery about pornography in rural life. And it's often the women are portrayed like these girls. Okay, now, we were talking this morning, I was with Brenda Blackwell, and we were talking about some salient exceptions to these images of women. And this is one that I think is one of the best. This is a movie titled Country. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it came out in 1984, and Jessica Lange was nominated for an Academy Award, and she portrays a woman who takes leadership in her community. What happened? This was during the period of repossessing of farms, you know, and there were musicians like Willie Nelson and John Mellencamp who developed Farm Aid to try to help people keep their farms. And so she is a mother, and she also works on the farm with her husband, and she has children, and they're going to lose their farm. And her husband, portrayed by Sam Shepard, just falls apart. He's a good man, he loves his family, but he turns to drinking. He just can't cope. He's going to lose this farm that's been in his family for a long time. What does she do? She rallies the community. She takes leadership. She challenges the banks. And how often do we see that? And how much credit do these films get? Very rarely, do we? We see more the negative stereotypes of rural women. And there's another reality. Well, I mean, they're characterized in different ways. This was another, this was a very popular show. You can probably see videos on YouTube, Hee Haw, which had really terrible stereotypes of rural people in general, and especially rural women. Yet it was on the air for, I don't know, about 11 years, and it was syndicated, and people watched it all over the world. So I want to talk about rural male-to-female physical violence and sexual violence. And it's starting to get more attention in criminology, and there are a growing number of us around the world who are starting to focus on this. But that's a hardcore reality of life for women in rural communities, a hardcore reality. And you know, when we think about violence in general, we think about the big bad city. We think about Atlanta, we think about Philadelphia, we think about Chicago. But there are communities, such as 3 in which I did in-depth qualitative research in rural southeast Ohio, that were structured specifically to maintain a very rigid gendered hierarchy that actually promoted violence against women. And I'm going to talk about that in greater detail soon. We have limited research on murders of women in rural communities, but of the few studies done so far, and actually most of them have been done in southern United States, like in California, most show that rural women are more likely to be killed by current or former partners than urban and suburban women. They're more likely. Well, how many people are surprised by this? Okay, no one, or maybe you're just shy. Often when I give presentations like this, people are surprised because what's constantly in the news is Chicago or Atlanta or Pittsburgh or whatever. Right? And why? This is a controversial topic, I realize, especially today, but guns do play a big role, whether we like it or not. And I'll use Canada as an example, which has a very, very restrictive gun legislation. You can't just go buy a gun, a handgun in Canada. It's very tough to get a gun, and handguns are almost impossible to own. And if you own one, you have to shoot it in a range, and there's very, very high levels of restriction. But 37.3% of small-town residents own a gun compared to 2.8% in places with over 1 million people. And many rural batterers own guns. Many do. And I'll get to the research on that in a minute. In fact, many men are encouraged and supported to use violence against women during hunting outings, which Dr. Hall Sanchez at West Virginia University has uncovered in her study of the rural hunting subculture and violence against women. She found that the hunting subculture was an integral part of male peer support subculture that contributed to violence against women. Male peer support is a concept that I developed, which refers to the attachments to male peers and the resources they provide that perpetuate and legitimate woman abuse. Now, over 30 years of research shows that regardless of whether the violence against women is in public housing, rural areas, colleges, South Africa, Chicago, that the men who are among the highest risk of engaging in a variety of types of abuse are those who have friends who are abusive to women and those who have friends who encourage the abuse of women or promote patriarchal beliefs and attitudes. And we have rich quantitative and qualitative data demonstrating that, and an international body of research showing that. And if you go to Dr. Hall Sanchez's site, you can download her work for free. If you go to her ResearchGate site on the hunting subculture and violence against women, it's really good data. It's really a good article. Now, most of the work started out here in the United States. Most of the research on rural violence against women was qualitative, because it's very hard to do a survey in a rural community. It's very, very hard, if not impossible in some communities. So what we do is rich, in-depth interviews, and those can be challenging because many women are at great risk of being killed, and if their partners find out about the interviews, that puts them at risk. In many small towns, everybody knows each other, and so on. So the work started out, my work started out very qualitative. I did rich, in-depth interviews with 43 women in rural southeast Ohio. These were women who wanted to leave, were trying to leave, or were in the process of leaving, or who have left their partners. Now, if you know anything about separation as a risk for violence against women, it constitutes a 6-fold increase in the risk of being killed. If a woman wants to terminate a relationship, if it's a woman-initiated termination of a relationship, it puts her at very high risk of being killed, especially if she was living with an abusive and controlling man. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the O.J. Simpson case. The only thing that makes that unusual is the fact that he was a celebrity, a very famous celebrity. That is a very common type of murder. And what echoes through the homicide data, talk to any police officer, be it in Atlanta, here, anywhere throughout the United States. And they'll tell you what consistently echoes through the homicide data is, if I can't have you, no one can. So when I did this study, and we interviewed 43 women who experienced harms few of us could possibly imagine. The abuse was multidimensional, physical, psychological, just hurting pets, and so on and so forth, because they challenged these men's masculinity by saying, I don't want to be with you anymore. And we were writing this stuff up, and it was pretty path-breaking at the time, at the risk of sounding self-serving. But one of the first questions that was asked is, well, how can you generalize these findings to a larger US population? I mean, you're looking at 43 women in rural Southeast Ohio. How generalizable are these findings? Well, the goal of the study was not to generalize across the United States. It was to get some exploratory data on a topic that no one was studying at that time. That is separation, divorce, sexual assault. But I took the question seriously, and it became an important question. Because people like Joseph Dodemeyer and other rural criminologists were making the claims, empirically based claims, by the way, that there are many rural communities that have higher rates of overall violence than urban and suburban. So I became like a dog on a bone. I had to answer this question, and I got together with Dr. Callie Renison, who redesigned the National Crime Victimization Survey, and Dr. Molly Dragowitz, who is now in Australia, and she's another world-leading expert on violence against women. And we said, you know, do you think we can use the National Crime Victimization Survey to determine whether rural women are higher risk or at lower risk? And Callie, she's a methodological genius. No one knows National Crime Victimization Survey better than her. She knows it inside out. And she said, let's do it. And we did it. We aggregated the data from 1992 to 2013, and guess what we found? Regardless of the intimate relationship status, we found that rural women are at much higher risk of experiencing intimate violence than their urban and suburban counterparts. So we now know conclusively from the second oldest survey ever conducted in the United States. The oldest, I believe, is the census, and the criminologists in the room, correct me if I'm wrong, the NCVS is the second. And so I think this is very important from a policy standpoint, especially for communities that are struggling for resources, to get more resources for shelter, for practitioners, and so on and so forth. This becomes a significant finding. But if you think about, what about the rest of the world? Criminology is also very Western biased, isn't it? I mean, how often do we read about crime and social control in Zimbabwe or Mozambique or Bosnia or other places like that? Well, there's a new body of knowledge that's emerging, a new framework titled Southern Criminology, which is trying to steer our gaze into other parts of the world. So when we look at the World Health Organization, they conducted a 10-country study, and much of their work was done, their survey work was done in rural areas. And they found, the World Health Organization also found, the highest rates of violence against women in rural parts of the 10 countries. So we know this now internationally. This is an international problem. Okay. Why? The question is why? We have data. We have data, but why? And I think we need to explain the problem. Why do we need to know why? Well, if we want to cure AIDS, we need to know why, what causes it. So theory isn't just something that professors do in their offices for kicks and giggles. Theory is very practical, and there was the father of contemporary social psychology, Kurt Lewin, once said, there's nothing so practical as good theory. So we need theory. Okay, I can't go into great detail about theory. I have developed theories of violence against women in rural communities, but I don't have time to get into it today. But I want to look at some of the key risk factors. Gun ownership is definitely associated with it. Patriarchal peer support, so if men who have attachments to abusive men and patriarchal men are high risk. This has been uncovered by a number of qualitative studies. What qualitative research does, it lets you get rich context, right, that you can't get from numbers. So when you sit down and talk to someone for about an hour to 3 hours, they can really give you a lot of information that you can't get in a survey that's administered for 30 minutes. The two types of methods should not be opposed to each other. They should work together, right? You're using them to answer different questions. We do find a rural patriarchy. Rural men tend to have a higher or a stronger adherence to the ideology of familial patriarchy. which it refers to male dominance and control in family or household settings. So there is a rural patriarchy. Not that there isn't a patriarchy in urban and suburban places, but as I told you, if you look at the data, rural communities are more conservative politically than are urban and suburban places. And so communities that are more conservative have more conservative views about gender relations, okay? It's not just whether you're a libertarian or you're a social democrat. And then abusive men are often protected by an old boys network. What we find in many rural communities is that the batterers are friends with police officers and judges and probation officers who protect these men, who preclude them from criminal justice intervention. And there's a wave of research that demonstrates this. In fact, all the 43 women we interviewed in rural southeast Ohio, one of the key policy recommendations they all made was break up the old boys network. Bring in police officers from outside. Now, this is a double-edged sword. You take Canada. How many of you have heard of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police? It's the federal police. They don't all look like Dudley Do-Right and wear these big cowboy hats and all that. But it's the federal police, and some communities can't afford their own police department, so they contract the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And the Royal Canadian Mounted Police has a strict policy. You are not to be in these communities for more than 3 years. So you move into a community, they take you out, so you don't develop these strong ties that contribute to an old boys network. Now there's a downside to this, of course. What happens if you have a family and you have children in school and you have a partner who works? So that's very problematic, okay? It's a double-edged sword, but many people argue it helps to prevent the creation of an old boys network. And there's wider acceptance of violence against women in many rural communities, especially if you read the World Health Organization research and some really good qualitative stuff that's coming out of Africa and other countries about how these communities are often structured towards oppressing women and so-called keeping them in their place. All right? There's always exceptions to the rule. I'm not painting all rural communities like this, but I'm a sociologist. You have to forgive me for that. So we tend to look at trends and patterns. That's what we do. Now, let's look at some more results. When we asked of the qualitative study, when we asked these women a set of questions, 84% said that sexual assault in their community is a problem. 81 said that. And look at the other data. 81% knew other women who were sexually assaulted. Now, you could say the same about the college community. We know in this country, because we have survey upon survey showing that at least 1 in 4 women have experienced sexual assault, college women, in their career. Our West Virginia University Campus Climate Survey found that 34% of women at WVU have experienced sexual assault. So obviously, it may not be obvious, I think it's obvious, it's not surprising that many women who live in communities, such as college communities, would know other women who have experienced sexual assault. The same applies in rural areas, if you think about that logically, right? Now, how many of you are familiar with social disorganization theory, or have heard of it, okay? How many of you have heard of collective efficacy? Okay, so social disorganization is the antithesis of collective efficacy. Now, what happens, there's a group of scholars led by a very famous Harvard criminologist, Dr. Robert Sampson, who claim that communities that are high in collective efficacy, in other words, communities that are mobilized and most people are working together with each other to act on behalf of the common good, more specifically to supervise children, have lower rates of crime than communities that are socially disorganized. And so if you're a community, according to Sampson and his colleagues and the old Chicago School of Criminology, if you're socially disorganized, people don't get together regularly with their neighbors. They're not willing to help each other and so on and so forth. There's alienation. There's a bunch of other factors here. So is life that simple? Well, Joe Donnemeyer, who's a very good colleague of mine, points out, and I found this in rural southeast Ohio, that social organization, if you want to call collective efficacy a form of social organization, it may facilitate some types of crime even as it constrains others. Now, what I found in my work is that people could count on their neighbors and friends to help prevent drugs in their community, try to prevent farm crime, vandalism, and so on. Public crimes, maybe, if you will, if you want to call them that, public crimes. But people were also organized as to create conditions conducive to violence against women. Now you think about gangs too. Sudhir Venkatesh, who wrote American Project, a great ethnographer and gang member for a day, he was kind of the first to steer us into thinking about avoiding this binary way of viewing communities as either socially disorganized or high in collective efficacy. What he discovered is that, now, if we look at Southside Chicago, okay, we just talked about high rates of homicide, does that mean that everything there is bad, that everybody is geared towards committing crime? What he discovered with the gang members, they weren't doing crime 24/7. Many of them were escorting young women through the community so they wouldn't be attacked. Many of them were going to buy groceries for elderly women who lived in the community. They were doing a lot of good things. So we can't just say a community's bad or a community's good. Communities can do both good and bad things, and I think it's important to recognize that. And Neil Websdale kind of started this off. This is a very important book. It came out in 1998, a really rich ethnography, and he kind of coined that term about violence, high rates of violence against women in rural communities, the Rural Old Boys Network. And if you read the rich interviews in this book, you'll be quite moved by them. And we followed up on this and found similar factors. Other things that rural women experience, this is what we know, fewer social support resources. Now you take the state of Pennsylvania, they don't go by percentages, they go by absolute numbers. So their percentage or their rate of rural violence against women is higher than the urban and suburban. But the state, in all its wisdom, says, well, the urban areas have so many and the rural have less, in absolute numbers, so the rural communities don't get anything, really. And many of the service providers put their own gas into their cars to drive miles and miles to help people in crises. So there's fewer social support resources. You have to cover large geographic areas. I mean, if you drive through the George Washington Forest, if you're driving, say, from West Virginia to Virginia, you'll see maybe one house, in certain sections, one house 50 miles apart from the next house. You'll see churches, which are the main kind of social meeting places for people. They come together for social activities, not only prayer, but maybe birthday parties, weddings, a number of other things, right? But so there's considerable isolation, and there's inadequate, if any, public transportation. In rural communities, a car is not a luxury. It's an absolute necessity. And what many batterers will do in these areas, knowing that, they'll take the carburetor out of the car, they'll do all kinds of things so that when they're away, that their partners can't flee the house of horrors. Now, this is something we're finding. I moved into doing research on pornography and violence against women, but we're finding that rural boys are consuming pornography more than suburban and urban boys, and the culture. See, many people stereotype. We could have started this lecture, by the way, by asking the question, what is rural? Because that question spawned major debates within the scholarly community. But one thing we do know for sure is that the boundaries, so-called cultural boundaries between urban and rural communities are blurred due in large part to new technologies. The internet, satellite, cable, streaming video, and so on and so forth. So people in rural communities are accessing these materials as much as people are in urban. But this was interesting research about the rural boys' use. I found in my research, the women we talked to, we didn't even have to bring it up. They talked about consumption of pornography, how their ex-partners viewed it and tried to get them to imitate what they've seen in pornographic media, which, by the way, is increasingly violent and racist. We live in a post-Playboy world. The mainstream pornography today is violent. 90% of the videos that are out there involve hair pulling, slapping, choking, painful anal penetration, and so on. I'm not going to get into all the gritty details. And then there's considerable amount of racism. And when you think about it, it scares me because we've raised a generation on the internet, and that's where most people get the porn. And the average age in which young American boys start viewing it is 11. And their first exposure to sex are these images. And it's something very worrisome, but that's a subject for a whole other lecture. The theoretical contributions, what do we know theoretically? What are people doing theoretically in the field? Interestingly enough, the bulk of the theoretical work on violence against women in rural communities draws from feminist feminism and prioritizes gender, which is very interesting. And more recent developments are integrating feminist thought with male peer support theories and some other variables. So that's where we're going theoretically in this field, which is interesting. Actually, the spate of knowledge that was generated in the latter part of the last decade, the bulk of it, as I mentioned before, came from feminist ways of knowing, which is interesting. We need to think about new ways. Where do we go from here? I basically, in a short period of time, summarized a growing literature. But what do we need to do now? Most of the data on non-lethal forms of violence against women come from women. Okay? There's a conspicuous shortage of qualitative and quantitative research on men. Now, I don't raise this point to say we need parity. That's not why I'm saying that. Not at all. There's a method to my madness here. Let's see. We certainly get rich information from talking to women, interviewing them, getting them to answer questionnaires and so on. They tell us a lot about the men they live with or who have lived with. They know them best. And I would always argue that the leading experts on violence against women are the women who've experienced it. Okay? Their experiences obviously give them that claim. But we acquire much insight from talking to men, interviewing them, and asking them to fill out questionnaires. If you really want to know, get rich evidence about why did you do this, you need to go to the source. You need to go to the source. Thorsten Selin, who was a famous Swedish criminologist, talked about how the further you are away from the source of the crime, the less accurate the data may be. I don't think that applies to violence against women, actually. I think, and in fairness to Selin, I think he was talking about other types of crime because during his heyday, violence against women was non-existent in the literature. So we have to examine everything within its historical context. But there is a point to it, this. We can acquire much from interviewing them. So if any of you are interested in doing some rural research on violence against women, talking to men and boys is very important. What about immigrants and refugees? I just don't put this up because this is a timely issue, but you take places like Iowa, there are a sizable portion of immigrants and refugees there, and in other parts of the United States. And think about if you are in the Dreamer program, I believe it's called, and you're worried. I mean, there's an onslaught, there's an assault on immigrants and refugees. And look at me. I'm a white male of privilege, but I have to say I feel very anxious because I have a green card. I immigrated here. And you start getting worried about all this discussion about immigrants and Americans first. And now the president wants to eliminate H-1B visas for visitors. I first came into this country on an H-1B before I got my green card. I wouldn't have this job. And again, I'm a white male of privilege, but think about this. If you are an immigrant woman and you're with a partner who abuses you, or a refugee woman and your partner says, if you say anything, I'm going to rat on you, and you're going to lose your children, and you're going to go back. That's a form of coercive control. That's really scary. You know, I think about, when I listen to the president, I think about all the immigrants and refugees and associate their, well-founded concerns with what may be going on behind closed doors. So we need more information on that. And let's not forget, a lot of immigrants and refugees, they just don't go to the city, they go to many rural communities. We need data about people with disabilities. There are people with disabilities who live in rural communities, and they get ignored. What about elder abuse in rural communities? We know very little about that. What about women in same-sex relationships? And I had a good discussion with folks here in the Criminal Justice and Criminology program about some of the work that's going on here on LGBT youth in rural areas. I think this is one of the most important topics. What I heard today, I was so excited. My eyes lit up, and I think this is going to help fill a major gap in the literature and really add to the outstanding reputation of scholarship that comes out of the Criminal Justice and Criminology program. Very important stuff. We need to know that. We need to know about other underserved populations, because not all rural communities are alike. And that's one of the important contributions made by rural criminologists. They're showing us through their research that you can't paint all rural communities alike. They're different. They differ. There may be some similarities in the sense that they may be small, their population density is smaller and so on and so forth. But, I'm sure a rural community outside here may be distinct from one, say 50 miles down the road. We don't know for sure. Pornography consumption and violence against women in rural areas. We've got some work on this. If you want, you can download it from my academia.edu or ResearchGate site. We have a new article in the journal Violence Against Women about pornography and violence, in the journal Violence Against Women, an article on pornography and violence against rural women. What about women in middle and high school? We don't know anything about that. And we do know that in urban and suburban areas, there are high rates of, quote, dating violence or intimate partner violence. We do have high school survey data, but again, gathered almost exclusively in urban and suburban areas. So this is another area we need to go to. Theoretical advances. Okay, I've listed some things that we need to study, but how do we advance theorizing the problem? What's becoming increasingly used, especially in feminist criminology, is intersectionality. In other words, how does class, race, ethnicity, and gender pattern intimate partner violence? See, gender is not the same as sex. They're related, but they're not the same. Sex is how, perhaps how people are biologically made up. There's debates about this, especially in light of, transgendered issues and so on. But gender refers to the sociocultural shaping and patterning of what society deems, what any particular society deems to be appropriate male and female behavior, dress, appearance, and so on. I'm giving a very simplistic definition of that because understanding gender is a very complex phenomena, right? So I'm giving kind of the Reader's Digest version here. But you think of, say, perhaps a woman of color. She's not only a woman, she faces discrimination because of her sex or perceptions of her sex, but also because of her color. Now, what happens if she is a lesbian? Then she faces homophobia as well. So how do these things connect, right? Because many of us have multiple identities. And so this is what people in the feminist community are trying to urge us to examine, and they are examining. And this intersectionality, though, is still restricted to the urban area. The intersectionality work I'm seeing focus primarily on the lives of African American and Latina girls and women. There's really no discussion about the rural folks, okay? So again, there is a small literature on rural indigenous communities, and I use the term indigenous to refer to, say, what you guys would call in the United States Indian people. In Canada, they would call them First Nations people. In Australia, they call them Aboriginal people. So they're all indigenous. They're all the first people. In fact, all of us here are the true immigrants. The first people in this country were the indigenous people, and we took their land. So where can you get some more information? Here's some sites. If you can write it down, and the literature is free. You can download this material for free, so please go ahead and do it. And also, if you're interested in certain schools of thought or certain types of criminology, you can go to ResearchGate and academia.edu and follow people that you think are interesting. And if they permit you to follow them, you can download their work. And many students find it very helpful with their term papers and so on. And it's kind of these two sites are kind of the Facebook of academia. And then you may want to look at these books. The one at the top is kind of a go-to book. It's the Routledge International Handbook of Rural Criminology. And it synthesizes the literature from around the world. It's a very good book, and it's a powerful testament to the fact that rural criminology has grown leaps and bounds in recent years. And that's edited by Joe Donnemeyer. There's a lot on rural violence against women in this book. I hate to shamelessly plug it, but it's Rural Criminology by Donnemeyer and me. And then you might find The Dangerous Exits, Escaping Abusive Relationships in Rural America, to be of some value. It features the tales of the women, 43 women. It's filled with the women's voices, and they describe their experiences in rural Southeast Ohio. So I'll end on that note, and we'll have time for questions and comments or anything else. So thank you very much for coming here. Now, don't be shy. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm really interested in rural health.
Oh.
What are some of the major themes that we've seen that have related to violence and depression?
Yes. Oh, she asked, just for those of you who may not have heard our colleague, she asked about what are some of the major health issues associated with violence against women in rural communities. And that's a very good question. Many of the women there don't have health insurance. And you know, if you talk about how people are worried about Obamacare disappearing, which will affect 24 million people in this country, and that's the entire population of Australia, by the way, 24 million. So many of the battered women don't have health care to begin with in these rural communities, so that's a problem. So when they're hurt, they can't go to the doctor. And so many of them suffer in silence and have long-term ailments and damage, especially reproductive health problems, because the violence, when I talk about violence against women, you can talk to other researchers too. All the violence that you may want to talk about is not mutually exclusive. In fact, in over 30 years of research, I've yet to conduct a study in which I have not found at least 80% of the women in my studies have experienced multiple forms of abuse. So another health implication is sexual aversion. A lot of women never want to have sex again. And sexual aversion is very common. Reproductive health issues, damage to reproductive health, depression, substance abuse. And this is one of the problems with, we were talking, Dr. Grubb and I were talking the other night about the level of in-service inventory, which is a test that's used to evaluate people coming into the prisons and so on, and to evaluate the type of service that they should get. They call it service. And women score very high on alcohol use, but they do it to dull the pain. Substance abuse too. And so when you're thinking about high levels of use of substances in rural communities, we have to look at the gendered nature of it too. And women's use, I would argue, is very much distinct from men's use. So substance abuse, reproductive health issues, depression, also stemming from isolation. The list goes on and on. Yeah, it's multiple. Very similar, that's not to say that urban women don't experience this too, but the lack of services becomes a very, very important issue, right? There's nowhere to go. There's just where do you go? And if your partner has blocked you from using a car, can you imagine you're sitting there, it's almost like you're in a horror movie. You're trapped in some isolated rural community, you can't go anywhere, your partner leaves the house, you're wondering what he's going to be like when he comes home. Is he out with the boys drinking moonshine? And I'm not exaggerating now, I'm not stereotyping. And when he comes home, is he going to be so angry over nothing and beat the living crap out of me? Think about that. Can you imagine sitting alone, what that does to you psychologically, what type of terrorism that is? You know, it's a form of patriarchal terrorism. I hope I answered your question. Yeah. Anybody else or any observations you want to make? Yes?
I just have a question about kind of your results that you pointed out, just kind of how you differentiate between unwanted sex and rape. Because you have them separately, you have different results from that.
Oh, what we did was, actually, I may have goofed up on the slide. It's important how you ask the questions. Never ask the word rape or sexual assault. So you asked, did you have sex when you didn't want to? And that's how we recruited the 43 women. We had posters and we had ads on the radio and said, did you have sex when you didn't want to with a current or former partner, when you wanted to leave or trying to leave, and so on and so forth. And then we let them talk about it. And then what we did after was categorize it as either sexual contact, sexual coercion, attempted rape, and rape. Yeah, because if you were to do a study, like just here, a campus survey, if any of you, and some of you might, if you use the word rape, I bet you'd get less than a 1% estimate. But if you asked a question, did you have sexual intercourse when you didn't want to because someone used a degree of force, that is, held your arm down or something like that, the rates will be much higher. So language really matters, yeah. How you ask a question really matters, because most people don't see what happened to them as crimes in the strict sense of the word. In fact, the closer the perpetrator and the victim or survivor are to each other, the less likely the victim is to see it as a crime. It's very interesting, you know, very, very interesting. And we know that less than 5% of women who are sexually assaulted report to the police anyway, so we can't rely on police statistics to begin with. So wording matters. How you phrase it, how you ask a question. Similar, from a practical grassroots standpoint, many of us will come into contact with people who have experienced abuse. We will. I mean, if you think about 25% at least in the college population, at least 11% of women in America in cohabiting and marital relationships will experience at least one form of violence on an annual basis. When you think about all these statistics that I can throw out to you, which actually underestimate the problem, because we have methodological issues related to underreporting, you think about that, you're bound to come into contact with someone. And so if they start talking to you about certain things, and you want to be a supportive friend, or you're a counselor or something, watch your language. It's not about offending, but there are ways of interviewing that can get you to information that you otherwise would not get. Yeah. That's a good question you asked. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, Brenda. Mm-hmm. Yes, and in this study, in Dangerous Exits, unfortunately the women had nothing good to say about the religious communities. In fact, they argued, well, they didn't argue, they clearly stated that their pastor or was not supportive. Some would say, go back to your husband and try to be a good wife, or pray a little bit more. Or the people that they thought they could count on, you know, the places of worship, turned their backs to them. And so there was this kind of community, a collective efficacy aimed at maintaining, you know, the traditional marriage. So no, they didn't have anything good to say, which is interesting. Yes?
I'm
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because when we asked the women what they wanted to see done, we started off with that. What do you want? What do you think would improve? They said education, 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 education. Education about the abuse. Now you're asking about their own education. It varied. I mean, of the 43 women we interviewed, I mean, some had a university education. Most had at least a high school education. But they wanted their talk about education focused more on raising awareness and educating their communities. And they were very concerned about that. But your question also is just, it's got me thinking too, because still we don't know. It's interesting to examine socioeconomic variations in that. We looked at racial, ethnic variations in rural women abuse using the NCVS, and we didn't really see any significant differences between Latina, women of color, and others. We didn't. So if that was going to be your next questions. But education, I'm going to check that out.
Honestly, employment, I'm really curious about how that relates, because I know a lot of rural women, low income, is kind of sustain a household, so I'm curious if that was at all.
Well, most of them, it's interesting how you define employment, and Brenda was talking about this too. We have to avoid stereotypes of the rural housewife sitting inside, because rural women do a lot of the work, right, if it's a family-owned farm. So I define that as employment, okay, even though it's not necessarily paid in the traditional labor force. But what's happening is you're seeing the Walmarting of rural America, right? Walmart's moving in and wiping out all traditional forms of labor. And so what is happening too with high levels of male unemployment, you take West Virginia, coal, it's gone. And I don't care what the politicians say, it's not coming back. So you find higher levels of female employment than male, but they're in the service industry. And what's worrying me, this is the next revolution that's going to come, and it's going to really hit hard, folks. It's going to hit hard. The service sector, is a healthy portion of it's going to be wiped out, because Amazon's going to use drones. There'll be robots in restaurants. You're already seeing this. Domino's is experimenting with pizzas. Uber is experimenting with, in Pittsburgh and San Francisco, driverless cars. Uber already has a subsidiary company called Otto, which is making driverless trucks. And so this is going to have a serious impact, especially on the female labor sector. This is coming because capitalism is so greedy. You know, the whole goal is to lower production costs and increase profits. And so this is going to be absolutely terrifying. And for these rural women who we see working in McDonald's, which is already experimenting with automated drive-throughs and so on, we're in for a nightmare. Our unemployment rate is going to increase substantially. And it's coming. It's coming. So I'm wondering what that's going to do to the rural communities too. I really do. I really do. But no, a lot of them do work. They do. They have to in order to keep the household surviving, because a lot of these men aren't going to work. Sawmill plants are closing. You take Nelsonville, Ohio, Rocky Boot and Plant Shoe moved to Puerto Rico, where they paid people 50 cents an hour. That devastated an entire community. All of these communities where men were primarily employed, the women now are struggling they're the so-called breadwinners. Any other questions? Yes, please, there's no rush. There's no rush.
So, you mentioned before, as we know that there's some very small communities, and you have to be very cautious because this is a very sensitive topic. So how do you go into a community to ask women about this topic? How do you pitch that, and how do you assure these things?
Good question. That was of central concern to the rural Southeast Ohio study. What we did, safety was the number one concern, but how did we recruit them? Okay, what we did, we put posters around the different communities. We didn't go to people's houses or anything. We put posters up in laundromats, we had flyers, we put things, all these posters saying, you know, dear residents of so-and-so, have you had this unwanted sex when you didn't want to because of this, this, and this? please call either Joanne or Mary at this number and let us know. We will pay you for your time and your transportation cost. Then we had NPR do free advertising for us. So Country and Western station did. Service providers would send messages out to their networks and so on. We used multiple forms of recruiting, and we were hoping that we'd get maybe 20 women, but we had 2 research assistants who were very well experienced in the area, and they carried cell phones 24/7. And so when people would call, and 43 women would call, and then we'd screen them, we'd ask them, we'd first of all say, thank you so much for calling, because we were the first they ever talked to. And that's the other thing, if you're ever doing this research, you are likely to be the first people that these folks ever talk to, like people who are professionals. They may have talked to friends, but to reveal to professionals. And then we asked them if they're 18 and if they experienced any type of unwanted sex, any type. We didn't define it, we didn't list it, just if they said they did. And then we invited them to an interview at a place and time of their choice. And we offered them $25. At that time, it was the going rate for interviews, and we paid their transportation cost. Most of them wanted to come to Ohio University for the interview. We didn't ask them how they got there. They didn't tell us how they got there. We also had another room for their children, so that if they had children, they could watch cartoons or draw. We had people looking after them, babysitting them, and so on. That's how you do it. You hope, you cross your fingers, because you can't go in that community. Because if someone sees you knocking on the door, you're in the diner and you're asking questions, oh my God, especially if they want to leave a partner, because that puts them at very high risk. And we started with the assumption that all 43 women were at great risk of being killed because of the process of separation. So that's, I think, one of the best ways of recruiting.
Did you provide any sort of like resources to them afterwards? Did you connect them with them?
Yes. What we did was we gave at the time, if we had to do it today, we'd do it a little differently. We gave them palm cards. They're like cue cards. And in small writing, we listed local organizations and national organizations because we were worried that maybe their partners would go through their purses if they were still living with them. Because our definition of separation was broad. We also included emotional exiting, because a lot of women can't leave, but they've cut themselves off emotionally from their partners. They're not going to have sex with them. They don't have any emotion for them, but they're trapped there. Now today, if I had to do it, you get these little lipstick containers. Have you seen those where you can roll up and put information in there? So if the partner or the ex-partner goes through the person's purse, they'll think it's just lipstick. That's, I think, the most effective way to do it now. And many organizations are doing it that way. Yeah. Yeah, safety is a big concern. It's a huge concern. And the other thing, too, which is concerning us methodologically, is phone surveys, because the response rates are going down and down and down because people are being inundated with telemarketers. And in West Virginia, our West Virginia crime victimization survey suffered. We started in the summer just as the floods were starting. And so the last thing people want to do is answer a survey. And then, of course, the election was gearing up, and politicians were calling people all the time. So phone surveys are decreasing. The question, and not everyone has access to the internet, too. So I don't know. I think we may be going back to, we have to use different types of methods. And I think some people who are very strict about representativity are going to have to bend a little bit, because I don't think we can do things with violence against women the same way we did. Any other questions? Yes?
Compared to urban that are used in the rural, so like higher suicide rates and trap?
I don't know, to be honest with you. That's a great question. And I'm sure we could find that. We could find the data. That would be a very good thing to examine, wouldn't it? Yeah. Yes?
Of the women that you work with, how many of them were mothers or had children?
The vast majority of the 43. I would say probably 98% of them. And that, I'm glad you raised the issue of children, sorry. Because children often become deadly pawns in the process of separation. They become targets. And if you look at these fathers' rights organizations, men's rights organizations, the men who typically want sole custody of children are men who have abused their partners. And the women talked a lot about the trauma their children experienced because the men get so angry and they use these children as pawns to get at that partner. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff about children in there. Like one woman, she told her partner she was leaving, she was going to leave. She came home one day and it was hard for her to leave, and she found her partner lying on the floor with her 2 children, young children, and he was masturbating to pictures of her that she didn't know were taken of her in just her panties and her bra. And there was, just all kinds of things that were, you can't imagine. And when you listen to this stuff, you start thinking, and I'm a sociologist, but you start thinking, are these guys pathological? But when you see so much of it, it's terrifying. And children, that's why I'm very concerned about supervision, during the process of separation, divorce. Supervised visits, I think, are very, very important, because we hear more and more cases of when you leave a child alone with someone who's been abusive to a partner, they get killed or beaten or abused. And that was very worrisome to us, too, what the children experienced. And I have some issues about this parenting issues about, can people be a good father after they've been abusive? And there are people who say, well, it's possible. And in fairness to them as social scientists, or maybe we're counselors, what is one of our goals? We want to improve society. We want to make people better, right? We would like to see that. But by the same token, it's very hard for us to emotionally grapple with this after someone's been so hurtful, right? It's hard for us to wrestle with that. That's why I say I have to be very open. I have very conflicting views on that. Anybody else have any questions or comments or observations? I know it's a depressing topic, but I think in general, I just want to say, I think in general, we need to study rural communities more, not just because they're scientific objects, but there's something I personally observed, and maybe you did too, during this election. There's a lesson to be learned from this, a very important lesson to be learned. The rural communities in general feel abandoned overall, and they have every right to feel abandoned. And I think as social scientists, we can play a very important role in highlighting their pain, their suffering, the good things about their lives too. As I said, 49% of the world's population is rural. That's important. And I think people, regardless of whether they're Republican or Democrat, feel marginalized, feel alienated, feel that their society has abandoned them. Their roads are falling apart. You take Morgantown. I mean, the average taxpayer in Morgantown, West Virginia pays over $1,000 a year because of damage to the vehicle because of the potholes in the roads. It's just terrible. All these trucks driving through in the road. I mean, they're giant potholes. And, the state neglects the rural areas. The federal government does. And then look at all the issues with drugs, depression, economic deterioration, and so on and so forth, that the rural areas really warrant our attention. They really do. And I think we could help, as social scientists, raise a lot of awareness and do a lot of good and develop really strong partnerships with communities. And I think that's one of the things what I'm hearing from the folks here at Georgia Southern, that's what they're trying to do. And I think that's going to be one of the most important contributions made by Georgia Southern University, is connecting with rural communities. And many students also feel that when they come, we forget that many students come to schools like this from rural areas. And, they may not say it, but they sit in our classrooms and they go, what does this have to do with me, with my life, with my community, my family, right? And that's why I think, you know, rural studies are very, very important and can do a lot and can bring inclusivity. Like when we talk about inclusivity in the classroom, we talk about LGBTQ issues, we talk about race and ethnicity, we talk about all kinds of differences. But I often don't hear in discussions about difference or inclusivity, rural. How many of you hear about that? And these folks, regardless of their sexual orientation, their racial, ethnic makeup, they're marginalized. There's an intersectionality going on there too. So I think it's where we really need to concentrate. We have tons of stuff on urban, tons of it. But what I pointed out here in terms of what we don't know constitutes just the tip of the iceberg. You know, lots of stuff we don't know about. And there are people who want to talk to us, and that's the interesting thing. If we took the time and effort to speak to people in rural communities, you'd be shocked at how they would talk. They would, you know, they'd feel a sense of dignity and respect, as long as we don't treat them as, you know, scientific material in some beaker or test tube. We don't pathologize them.
All right, let's give Dr. Dekeseredy.
Thank you.